Good evening, everybody. Welcome. My name is Sean Barney, President of Progressive Democrats for Delaware. We very much appreciate you being here today. We're excited to hear from the candidates, to give you this opportunity to ask your questions of the candidates. And we very much want to thank the candidates for giving us their time here. We know how busy they are with their campaign schedules. I did want to just note you should all have received or have a note card in front of you. We encourage you to submit the question. If you do have a question, John will be coming around and he'll get those up to me. We already have questions that have been submitted online and by email, so we're looking to ask candidates what you want to hear. So please do feel free to submit a question. The way we're going to work this, each candidate's going to have 3 minutes to introduce themselves to you, and then we're going to proceed to questions from there. Each candidate will get 2 minutes to answer the question, and we'll rotate the order in which they answer. Check the seats. So for opening statements, we're going to first hear from Ms. Robbins.
Good evening. I'd like to begin by thanking Progressive Democrats for Delaware and Mill Creek Fire Company for having us here this evening. I'd also like to say good evening to all of the attendees and my fellow candidates. My name is Lucretia Roberts, and I'm running to be Delaware's next Attorney General. I'm a native Delawarean. I grew up in Newcastle, and I attended William Penn High School. It was during my time in William Penn High School where a teacher actually asked me to try out for the mock trial team. I did it, and I fell in love, and I knew that one day that I would be a Delaware attorney. So I left briefly to attend Pace University in New York and came back to Delaware to attend Delaware Law School. Once I got settled in law school as an evening division student, I began working full-time in a law firm. During my time in a law firm, that was the first time in my life where I actually questioned and second-guessed my decision to become an attorney. But fortunately, I ultimately ended up at Newcastle County Family Court. When I started working for the court, I worked as a mediation officer, and there I had the opportunity to work very closely with Delawareans who were struggling at a very difficult time in their lives. And I also came in contact with Delaware's youth. Family Court had their diversion program for first-time offenders, and youth would come in contact with our program, and I would actually have an opportunity to work with them to resolve their charges in their favor. So what I loved about that work was that the youth, I could see something really special in them, and I hoped that I could encourage them to do better and see their full potential. So once I started that work, I started to feel like I had found my niche, where I would start to practice law. But interestingly, my own family experienced its own hardship shortly after I started my job in family court. Sadly, I lost a family member. My cousin was gunned down in the city of Wilmington. So for the first time in my life, I not only knew what my career path would be, because I knew I would always be a family law practitioner, but I knew I could take it one step further. I knew what my purpose would be. So I would spend my career as an attorney building up youth, building strong families, because they're the foundation of a thriving community. But I would also work really hard to keep our community safe. So after clerking for the Chief Judge of Family Court, I ended up going to the Delaware Department of Justice. I was sworn in as a Deputy Attorney General. I chose a path that was different than most attorneys. I decided to work in the Family Division. And it was during my time in the Family Division that I represented the Children's Department in litigation to bring youth into foster care. And I also did criminal work. So I handled misdemeanor and felony cases in the juvenile and domestic violence units.
I'll let you wrap up.
Oh, okay. Thank you. So Matt then appointed me to be the director of the Family Division and then the Chief Deputy Attorney General. I left that position to run for Attorney General. I look forward to the opportunity tonight to share with you my vision for the office. And once again, thank you for having me.
Thank you. Next, we'll hear from Ms. Jennings.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for putting together this forum and inviting all of us to attend tonight to talk about the Attorney General's office and our vision. I have never run for political office before, but I am running now because we are at a pivotal time in Delaware when we need an experienced leader to keep us safe. We need Delaware to be a safe place to live, to work, and most importantly, to raise our children. I am running because I want to make sure that our justice system is fair to everyone who comes before it. And I am running for Attorney General because I want to make sure that we give people in need of treatment the help that they need and not a prison cell. I want to make sure that people with mental health issues are given treatment as well, especially our veterans returning from war. I was born and raised in the city of Wilmington in a small house in the 40 acres to a single mom. My mother taught me everything I know, but the most important thing she taught me is that we are our brother's keeper, and that we are here on earth to help other people less fortunate than we are. And so, upon graduating from law school, it is no surprise that I joined the Attorney General's office in the criminal division because I wanted to help victims of crime, and I wanted to make our communities better. When I joined the office, there was one other female in the entire criminal division, Lucy Serino, and I owe her everything I learned about trying cases because she took me under her wing. Otherwise, the law enforcement community in which I worked was almost entirely men. So I know what it's like to come up in a very different world from what you're used to and to struggle to get ahead. I started out trying misdemeanor cases, and my experience has led me from misdemeanors to domestic violence cases, to child abuse cases, to the first ever rape unit where I tried rape cases and child sexual abuse cases. I went on to try homicides, including Delaware's only serial killer, Stephen Brian Cannell. Subsequent to that, Charlie Early appointed me to be Chief Deputy Attorney General, where I started the first ever consumer protection unit by seeking and securing legislation to strengthen consumer rights against frauds and scams committed against our residents. It was a bad year for Democrats when Charlie ran for the U.S. Senate, and so we went into private practice together, where I defended people accused of crime, where I represented teachers across this state to secure their employment rights. And then Beau Biden came knocking on my door and asked me to come back and run the criminal division. I had the great good fortune to work with Beau for 4 years, where we started a crime strategies unit that got prosecutors out from behind their desks into the hardest hit, the most violent communities in our state, working directly to solve what was broken, whether it be vacant houses or blight, or whether it be violence on our streets. The last case I tried as a prosecutor involved a little 5-year-old girl who was shot walking out of the door of her Hedgeville neighborhood. I am running for Attorney General because I don't want any other child to suffer that fate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next we hear from Mr. Jones.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me here tonight. My name is Chris Johnson. Many of you already know me, as I've been a member of the progressive community for many years. You also may know me as Vice Chair of the Platform Committee back in 2017, in which we had the most progressive platform in state party history. I currently also serve as Vice Chair of the City of Wilmington Democratic Committee, where I've worked tirelessly for the past few years to rebuild and re-energize our local party. City of Wilmington is where I call home and is where I worked for many years as an attorney representing the City of Wilmington, Police Department, Mayor's Office, and City Council. My most recent post, I was legal counsel and criminal justice advisor to Governor Carney. I'm running to be Delaware's next Attorney General because our criminal justice system is truly broken. And the brokenness in our system has disproportionately impacted low-income and minority communities. The problem is mass incarceration. The problem is destabilization of neighborhoods. And that is what drove me to step up and say enough is enough. We have to rebuild our neighborhoods from the ground up. So what I plan to do, I'll talk about later tonight, but I just wanted to talk about how we need transformational change in the Attorney General's office. And I believe my experience gained outside of the Attorney General's office and the right vision will allow me to be successful as Delaware's next Attorney General. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next,
good evening. Thank you to the Progressive Democrats for putting this on and being able to put us all together so you can hear our views. And thank you for participating, because it's important for us to be able to get our views out to the members of the community. I'm a newcomer. It's my first time running for partisan election. My name's Tim Mullaney. I'm from Dover. I'm married, 6 kids, 13 grandkids, so it's usually pretty busy at my house. My background, I'm a Vietnam vet, and when I came back, I entered the Dover City Police Department, spent 20 years with the department, retiring as a lieutenant involved in the Criminal Investigations Unit. As well, I went to Polytech High School, taught criminal justice for a couple years, went to night school, got my law degree, and a year after that I got admitted to the bar in Delaware and Pennsylvania. At that time, I was appointed by President Clinton and cleared by the Senate to be the U.S. Marshal for the District of Delaware. I served in that position for 8 years. When I left there, spent 2 years as county attorney for Newcastle County under the previous Gordon administration, and also spent 1 year as the chief administrative officer just recently under his last administration. But most relevant to this race is the fact that I spent 8 years with the Delaware Department of Justice. Spent a couple years as the director of the Consumer Protection Unit, was then the head of the Fraud Division, and for the last 4 years, I was the chief of staff to Attorney General Biden. It was in that position that I was able to have a overview scope of what was going on in the Department of Justice, and not only from the prosecution standpoint, but also from the standpoint of our other divisions, the family, the civil, and the fraud divisions, which are equally important components of the criminal justice system. But that's my background. I'm currently Labor Services Director for the National Fraternal Order of Police. I administer and contracts and negotiate contracts for smaller agencies across the country, about 105 of them, that aren't able to negotiate by themselves. So with that, I'll get ready to answer any of your questions and look forward to doing so. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The first question goes first to Ms. Jennings. The United States locks up more people than any other nation on earth, and Delaware prisons at a rate higher than the U.S. as a whole. In fact, there's only one state outside the South with a higher incarceration rate. Do you believe it is possible and desirable to reduce the incarcerated population in Delaware? If so, by roughly what percentage do you think it is realistically to aim to reduce the incarcerated population in Delaware? How do you plan to use your office to accomplish this, if it is the goal?
Thank you for that question, because that is one of the reasons I am running. We have a high incarceration rate, and that high incarceration rate has not made us safer. That is why many, many years ago, I joined the board of the Hope Commission and began working on reentry programs in our state, because change is possible. And change is possible when we provide people who are in prison with the necessary programs, with education, and then we provide them with transition services so that when they come out of prison, they can continue to receive services and get a job and become productive members of our society. We have a high incarceration rate, and we have a recidivism rate that over 3 years post-release from prison is over 70%. That is unacceptable. What is happening is that people are cycling in and out of our prisons. The way to effectively reduce incarceration, one way, is effective rehabilitation programs. Two of my closest friends that I've met along the road on this path to reentry include people who serve substantial time in prison. One just graduated from college with honors. The other runs his own reentry program now. Change is possible if we reduce the recidivism rate. We also must sentence people more fairly. The system has become an assembly line of justice instead of an individualized sentencing court. And judges, we have to trust judges to be just. But right now, we stack mandatory sentences on top of one another, and it is a matter of numbers of years and not of individual justice. And so, even if someone must go to prison because they are frankly dangerous and they've done a violent act, the question is for how long and why are they there for that length of time?
Thank you. Same question to Mr. Johnson.
I think you're going to find tonight that we're all probably going to be in agreement on this issue, that there's too many people in prison. The thing is, what are we going to do about it? And I do agree that recidivism is what we have to focus on. Focus on recidivism has to be the #1 goal. Because again, we have to give folk in the community options. Right now, we have a big court expansion coming to Delaware. But guess what? We can't fill those jobs because we have a lot of folk who have records and they're not properly trained and they cannot enter those thousands of jobs in which will be coming to Delaware soon. That is a huge problem. So it's job training, it's skill building, and it's also just treatment because a lot of the support folk transitioning back into society need is emotional support. So it's the mental health, the substance abuse, but it's also the emotional end because they have been beaten down by a system for a long time. So that is what we need to work on. And then the second biggest step is working on how the prosecutor's office works. Because at the end of the day, the prosecutor has more power than even the judge in our current system. And that's unfair. So we need to work to level the playing field. Work on revising, the criminal code. Work on sentencing reform. Work on actually empowering the parole board to grant parole. Because Delaware is one of the few states in which you can't actively get parole. So we have a lot of issues, a lot of deep-rooted issues that have been going on for decades. These problems aren't new. And those in power knew about the problems and did nothing. So my goal is to simply work at the root of the problem and try to untangle decades and decades of mass incarceration. And a really reachable goal is to reduce the prison population by 5 to 10% each year. So the next 5 years, we have a 50% reduction. And it can be done because it's been done in New York State. And that's a perfect example. We're right up the road. We have New York State is getting ready to close Rikers Prison because their prison population has been reduced so much. So we have examples and we can do it in Delaware.
Thank you. Next to Mr. Mullane.
First, I think what we have to look at is that it's not just a criminal justice problem, it's a societal problem. I mean, mass incarceration, because there's so many different elements to it. And we have to approach this from that perspective and not just look at our own little silo and work within that area. So, but what the AG does have the ability to do is looking at bail reform. And whether or not the people that are actually being held with not able to make bail or without bail, that they are the people that we need to be protected from, or are a flight risk. But there has to be serious problems. And when you have people that are not a flight risk, or not a danger to anyone, we should be looking at how we're handling them. And what we're doing sometimes is, and especially low income, those people are going to end up in jail. we need to dial back and look at ways that we can fix that aspect of it. The other aspect is along the lines with what was already been said in regard to recidivism. We let people out of jail and tell them, all right, you're on probation, put them in the same environment that caused the initial problems and expect a different result. I mean, it just doesn't work. So what we need to do is, like everybody's saying, there has to be programs, but not only programs, but there has to be, if they graduate from a program, there has to be more than a certificate. There has to be a job, or there has to be a location for them to go. And we have to keep on building on that because our recidivism rate is just ridiculous. So those are the things that I think that we have to outline and what we have to do it. But I think it's a twofold thing. You look at before conviction, and then you look at after conviction and make sure that we're doing the best we can on both ends.
Thank you. Next question goes first to Mr. Johnson. Sorry, Ms. Rob.
Thank you. So I think we have to take two issues into consideration when we're talking about mass incarceration. Really, first we have to address how we approach crime, and we also have to address how we approach prosecution. So on the front end, when we're talking about the approach to crime, we have to focus on community policing. That is a huge way to really address how police are engaging with the community. It's a way to avoid the crime from happening in the first place. So when we have community policing, we have police officers who are engaged with the community, building trustful relationships, and really working to be visible to avoid the crime in the first place. We also have an opportunity for prevention. So to the extent that we can really push for pre-arrest and diversion services, pre-arrest and diversion programs, that's an opportunity to avoid having someone become incarcerated. On the prosecutorial side of things, we really have to focus on changing a culture. The tough on crime approach of the past really hasn't worked, and that's what's led to this issue of mass incarceration. So as Attorney General, I would be committed to changing a culture and really making sure that prosecutors are focused on best outcomes based on an individual case, taking into consideration the circumstances of the victim, the defendant, and society, what's best for society as a whole. The other piece is, on the reentry side of things, we really have to make sure that we're putting returning citizens in a position to succeed so that they're not funneled back into the Department of Corrections. And we can do that multiple ways. The Department of Justice can really step up and advocate for effective reentry programs in the state of Delaware. We can also push policies that help returning citizens transition smoothly and maintain stability in their communities. For example, Senator Margaret Rose Henry has a bill to help returning citizens get their identification, something that simple. Thank you.
And sorry about that. Now the next question will go first to Mr. Johnson. And it's a follow-up to this discussion and actually touches on something that Ms. Roberts touched upon. The question is, there's a new book claiming mass incarceration was caused by overzealous prosecutors. Do you agree that prosecutorial practices have contributed to mass incarceration? Do you plan to keep deputy, assistant deputy AGs at the current level?
Yes, I completely agree with the statement alluded to in the book that the prosecutors, again, have too much power. And I actually want to reduce the prosecutors' power in the system. Because of the way the laws are written, they have so much leverage. And that is, again, causing defendants over 90% of the time to plea out their case because they have so much pressure. And that really is the deep root of it. And again, this is something that is touched on in many studies, is that the office, again, has to mirror the community. Our prosecutor's office does not. Diversification is a huge problem in that office. And I have been advocating for years through the Bar Association and through being the head of diversity in the Bar Association and working on that issue, because the Attorney General's office has one of the biggest problems. It doesn't even become close to mirror the great diversity that Delaware has. But again, if you have prosecutors who come from all different backgrounds, you're able to assess the playing field a different way. So that's, again, has to be a focus. And number 3 is this training. They're very talented prosecutors. It's a lot of talent at the office. But again, it has to be best practices that are reinforced from the bottom up, and everyone gets the same playbook that, look, we're not here to win as prosecutors, we're here to seek justice. And if it means losing a case or letting somebody off, that's what has to be done. So in a nutshell, I believe the prosecutors and the ethics and just the goals have to be changed. And that's what I'm willing to do as Attorney General.
Thanks to Mr. Mulaney.
First, I think we have a very dedicated staff of attorneys and support personnel in the Department of Justice. Part of it's the climate and the manner in which things have been done in the past, where you look towards convictions as being the measuring stick of whether or not you're moving forward or doing a good job. And I think what we have to do, and the change in criminal justice system is always hard. Everybody, the police arrest, the Department of Justice prosecutes, and the judge's sentence. And it's that same way without any deviation, and we have to look at changing that culture. And what we have to do is empower our prosecutors to realize that they're not going to be judged solely on the fact of what their end result is, but on whether or not the end result equates to a justice for all involved. And to make sure that we're treating everybody on a fair level, not just the fact that someone's able to hire an expensive attorney and therefore they get a better plea deal than someone that's dealing with a public defender who's overburdened. We have to look at how that dynamic is going. We also have to look at our law enforcement, and because there's a little bit of a dance, for the lack of a better word, where because they realize there'll be plea bargaining involved, you'll see more charges being levied than maybe should be charged. And what we've got to do is figure out a way to get law enforcement to understand, let's charge what's appropriate, let's have the prosecutors look at the earliest possible time and stop any charge stacking and making sure that charges are legitimate for the crime that's being committed, and then have some consistency across the board. And this is where your middle management in, I think, the Department of Justice comes in, is make sure that there's consistency across the board of what's being offered in the same type of crime, so that you don't have the disparities between the rich, the poor, and also along racial lines. So what we have to do is change the culture and how it's being viewed. But until we, from the top down, give them that guidance, it's going to be the status quo. So that's what we need to do, is make sure that we're doing things in a better and a more equitable manner.
Thank you.
Thank you. So you're right, I started to touch on this a bit before, but prosecutorial discretion is huge. And one thing that I've noticed as I've really gotten out here and had conversations with constituents is that there is a legitimate concern about criminal justice reform and prison reform. And there is an expectation that the Department of Justice be proactive in addressing these issues. That will be key. So while we're moving forward, we're pushing policy in the areas of reform to make sure that there's fairness in the criminal justice system. That also has to occur within the office, within the Department of Justice. Prosecutors have to exercise their discretion in a way that is truly fair. I think that in order to do that, it's really going to require, some tough times. Change is difficult, and the Attorney General has to be committed to really making that change occur. That can happen in multiple ways. One is education. That's going to be incredibly helpful. And also training opportunities. And finally, we have to change the way that we are evaluating performance at the Department of Justice. Prosecutors need to understand that it's not the number of cases you try or the outcomes in the cases with regard to the number of years that an individual is sentenced. It's a question of what is the best outcome for every defendant. Every case has to be evaluated on everyone's individual circumstances. So if it's better to maintain a defendant in the community so that they can get services and maintain their employment, then so be it. That's a good outcome.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Change begins at the top. It begins with the Attorney General. And it begins with the leaders that that Attorney General appoints to lead the offices in the Attorney General's office. We have very good prosecutors in that office. I am very proud of the work they do in the courtrooms and for the cause of justice and in protecting victims. They're not to blame. There's one thing that is primarily to blame, and that is the proliferation of minimum mandatory sentences that the law says have to be stacked on top of one another, because those facts, the fact that we have this huge number of minimum mandatory sentences that result in consecutive sentencing, creates this assembly line of justice and shifts the balance of power from judges where it belongs to prosecutors where it doesn't. And so what happens when you have a proliferation of minimum mandatory sentences is that judges lose discretion and prosecutors and defense attorneys are bargaining numbers of years, and that is a bad thing. That is why I have fought to reform our criminal justice system, doing away, effectively, been successful in effectively doing away with 3 strikes and you get a life sentence. And I have successfully sought and achieved legislation that would enable more crimes, the vast number of crimes, to be sentenced concurrently and not be stacked on top of one another. But more of that kind of work is needed. And I think the best judge of the future is what the prosecutor has done in the past. And that is, if that prosecutor is doing justice, protecting the rights of the victim, ensuring that the accused's rights are being taken into account, and that a fair and just resolution is reached, and with judicial discretion, we will reduce mass incarceration and we will shift the balance of power where it was when I started in the office, and that is in the hands of some of the best judges we have in the country.
Thank you. This question goes first to Mr. Mullany. Earlier this week, Senate Bill 203 was introduced in the General Assembly. This legislation would significantly increase the mandatory minimum sentences for felonies involving guns. In some circumstances, doubling sentences from 5 years to 10 years or 10 years to 20 years. Do you support this legislation? More generally, how do you propose as Attorney General to reduce gun violence while also reducing mass incarceration?
Well, first of all, when you look at doubling sentences and doing things, you see right now that there are the current gun sentences that are on the books that are usually plea bargained away the first thing out of the gate, which gives the argument about not enforcing the current penalties that are there. So I'm not in favor of just adding some more penalties. What we need to do is find a different approach to what we're doing and making sure that we're arresting the people for the right reasons, and those that are abusing weapons and causing serious violent crimes are incarcerated. I think what we have to look at is there's a whole bunch of bills dealing with guns and so forth. I think the most important piece of legislation was House Bill 302, which was dealing with those with mental deformities or temporary problems with their mental health, and making sure that the weapons are out of their hands. And it's not only from a serious and violent crime standpoint for other people, but also one significant purpose is to reduce the number of suicides that are occurring. So I think that there are ways and means that we have some responsible legislation and laws currently. I just think we have to approach the way we enforce those in a meaningful manner. And, we have to look at minimum mandatories. I think some are appropriate. But when you're looking at just piling it on when the initial ones aren't working, and thinking that just by making the prison sentence longer that it's somehow going to solve the problem. I think it's the wrong tack to take.
Thank you, Rob.
Thank you. So when we're dealing with issues related to guns, I'm a firm believer that we need to deal with common sense solutions related to guns. There under no circumstances should Delawareans be feeling unsafe in public. But there are a couple of ways to do that. One, I think that prosecutors do need to aggressively prosecute gun crimes. Second, I do think that the Beau Biden gun bill is another effective means for the Department of Justice to step up and make sure that anyone who poses a risk to themselves or others does not have access to a gun. But I think we have to be careful when we talk about minimum mandatory sentences. There is a range of reasons for individuals being involved in gun crimes, and we really do have to depend on judges and prosecutors to exercise solid discretion in making recommendations for sentencing. If we go to the default of minimum mandatory sentences, that only leads us down the path of where we are today, with just growing prison populations. And really what we're looking at is over 90% of that population is going to return back to the community. So we have to focus on making sure that we're putting individuals in a position. Yes, they have to be prosecuted, but a longer sentence doesn't necessarily mean that we're really dealing with the risk of safety to the community.
I do not support that bill. And in fact, if I were Attorney General, I would oppose it on the floor of the legislature. I support bills that make us safer. And I support bills that really ought to be passed. The Beau Biden gun violence protection bill, I supported it after Sandy Hook and testified on the floor of the Senate in favor of it. We couldn't get it done then, but we've got it done now. And I am so very grateful because it will make us safer. I do not believe that weapons of war should be in the hands of civilians. I support a ban on assault weapons. I do not believe that we need extended magazines that hold 30 rounds. There's only one purpose for assault weapons and extended magazines, and they are to kill as many people as can possibly be killed in as short a period of time as possible. That is wrong. If we ban those weapons of war and we ban extended magazines, we will be safer. So I support gun safety measures when they make us safer. I do not support more minimum mandatories that do not make us safer.
I would have to say, I know the bill is signed into law, but as Attorney General, I would have opposed that increase of penalties as well. And that just talks about a bigger issue, is why the Attorney General is so important. We need racial impact statements in our legislation. That's something that other states are doing around the country. It's something that, for some reason, has not been done in Delaware. Because again, when you have laws on the books that disproportionately impact a community, we need to be looking like we look at fiscal impact statements and say, hey, something's wrong. We need to look at this. And it's happened throughout for decades in Delaware, and they've gotten away with it. Well, it stops now. So that's the first thing, and that's why those kind of bills are bad. And second of all is looking at all the gun control legislation, gun safety legislation. It sounds nice, and a lot of it is good, and I applaud the efforts. But again, banning assault rifles does not help what's going on 4th Street. It does not help what's going on in Dover. It does not help what's going on in Rehoboth. That's where we need to get to the solution of the gun crime every day. Because the fact is, the folk causing the havoc out there might not necessarily be mentally ill. They have other underlying issues that we're not addressing. And so under my Attorney General leadership, we will directly address these activities through gang intervention programming, where we're putting folk back in the community to serve and giving, the offenders other options. And, through intervention programming, giving job training, those kind of things. And the best way we're going to do this is we're going to find resources by saving on prison costs in working, with the General Assembly to free up resources. So that's my take on the gun control debate, is that I applaud these efforts, but that only addresses the mass shooting situation, school safety, but we need to address what's going on in our everyday communities.
Thank you. The next question goes first to Ms. Roberts. When the Trump administration violates the law or infringes on the well-being of Delawareans, what steps will you take as Delaware's Attorney General?
So, when the Trump administration came into office, at that time, I was actually serving as Chief Deputy Attorney General. So I was already being proactive in addressing the Trump administration's unconstitutional and just unfair practices and policies coming out of Washington. Quite frankly, they're discriminatory. And so I understand the importance of the office being proactive and really monitoring the policies coming out of Washington. And secondly, working very closely with other Democratic AG's offices to make sure that we are involved in that litigation and that we're advocating to protect the rights of Delawareans. So much so, I found that work so important that I actually created a position in the civil division to make sure that there was an attorney dedicated to doing that work related to the Trump administration. So as an Attorney General, I would continue to make that work a priority and certainly continue to support the organized efforts of Democratic AG's offices in this area.
Thank you, Ms. Jennings.
Well, the Trump administration is one of the reasons I'm running, because I was frankly shocked and appalled at our president's policies, rhetoric, etc. And so, yes, the Attorney General is the people's lawyer, and the Attorney General is the guardian of our rights. Attorneys General across the country have stood up to the Trump administration in the areas of environmental rights, immigration, and in the area of our own reproductive rights and health care rights. Hard-fought rights that women have, that environmental activists have had, that the Obama administration gave us in terms of health care are being rolled back as we speak. And it is up to the attorneys general of each state to stand up and say no. And you stand up and say no by filing a lawsuit against illegal practices and the rollback of our constitutional and statutory rights. If I am Attorney General, I will protect the rights of all Delawareans to a safe environment, to our right to determine our own bodies, to health care, and to the rights of people to be free from illegal practices of the Trump administration.
Thank you. Mr. Mullane.
First, I applaud Attorney General Dan for the work he's done in this arena. I think he's recognized from the beginning that he had to be an advocate against some of these policies that the president has put forth. And he's filed he's been signed on to several lawsuits that's been filed through our multi-state investigations. I anticipate following through the same way Attorney General Den has and being proactive when we think that there's going to be some problems, start getting up with our fellow states and look at strategies to start dealing with these things before he's had a chance to formalize them by listening to his Twitter feed, what he's going to be doing or trying to do. So I think we all agree that we have to be strong and we have to work with our fellow states because our strengths in numbers to make sure that we're advocating for our citizens.
Mr. Johnson.
And like Ms. Roberts, on day one when I came into the governor's office, I was faced with the task of working with the Attorney General's office to figure out how to combat Trump. Because he is, as everyone on the stage has said, he's attacking us every way he can. He's deregulating our financial sector, our healthcare industry, and environmental justice is being rolled back. Everything is like all at once, and he distracts us with these Russian investigations so we all, don't focus on what he's actually doing. But he's getting a lot done. He's even appointed a lot of judges, the most ever for the first year and a half in office. So again, under my Attorney General office, we will work with the other Democratic AGs and figure out a plan on how to solve this. But the thing is, my office just won't be signing on to these lawsuits. My office will actually, be proactive and have Delaware be the leader, because that's the thing. What happened this week, we actually lost a really good AG. We lost Eric Snyderman, who was actually at the forefront of combating the war against Trump. He was the leading AG, one of the leading AGs. So we need somebody now in this country to step up and say, look, I'm going to be the first one to gather everyone together and rally so we can attack Trump, because it really is a lot is at stake, and for the next 2+ years we have to fight every step of the way. The Attorney General's office is the office that will be protecting all Delawareans, no matter what you look like or who you love.
Thank you. Next question goes first to Ms. Jennings. What will the Department of Justice's policy be under your leadership with respect to cooperating with ICE and or referring defendants to federal immigration enforcement?
Thank you for that question. I think the best way to answer that is to tell you what I have done as the Chief Administrative Officer of Newcastle County, together with Matt Meyer in his leadership as County Executive. One of the first things we did was work to protect our immigration community. The police chief of Newcastle County came to us and said, I'm not participating in an ICE raid unless you make us participate in an ICE raid. And we said, no, you do not. You do not need to do that. That is not required of you. A massive raid on people who are doing their jobs, who are at their places of employment. You do not need to do that. And so I would advocate for not doing that statewide. And indeed, I believe that our police agencies are in line with that. The second thing is that we want people to use our parks, our libraries. We want children to join sports leagues. And what we were seeing was a decline in those numbers. And we believe that that decline was directly attributable to fear in the immigrant community. We need to tell Delawareans, and as Attorney General, I would ensure that we protect Delawareans from that kind of fear, because they are a part of who we are and what makes Delaware great. And so ICE raids, we will not participate. And secondly, we will make sure that people feel safe to enjoy the great things that Delaware has to offer. And most importantly, from the Attorney General's perspective, to report crime. Because if people are afraid, then they are truly being victimized. They are being victimized and they have no redress. And so if people who are here in our state want to report a crime, they do not get asked, what is your immigration status? And I will make sure that stays the case.
Thank you. Mr. Johnson.
As Attorney General, protecting the most vulnerable segments of our population will be my priority. And immigrants are the lifeblood of our state, and that will be a priority for me. Now, the unfortunate status of Delaware, that Delaware is not a sanctuary state. We don't even have sanctuary cities. So there is still that fear, and we've had it in this state recently, where folk can be hauled off and handcuffs by ICE. So we do have that legitimate fear out there, and because some jurisdictions may not be friendly towards ICE, there are some jurisdictions that still comply with all what the Trump administration wants. So I know from my experience in the governor's office, it is a kind of mixed bag. So I believe we need consistency statewide on this is going to be the policy and practices state law enforcement officers will file. And guess what? Cities are suing the Trump administration. This state can sue the Trump administration. It's just it has not happened yet, unfortunately. But under my Attorney General leadership, I will be looking to face the Trump administration head on, because he's threatening to cut federal funding. Okay, he threatens a lot of things. We can step up, and we can use our legal recourses to fight against them.
Thank you, Mr. Mullane.
First, the role of the AG's office directly with these ICE raids is minimal. What they're looking for mostly is possibly an AG. I personally would not support that aspect of it. We have scarce resources as it is. I'm sure not going to waste them on an effort such as that. I think my advice would be to law enforcement would be you have better things to do. If you're looking at crime, if they're targeting crime, criminal activity, fine, let's look at that. If there's a gang that's doing drugs that has some type of immigration status, look at that aspect. But it's got to be from a criminal standpoint that they're actually doing harm in our state, not by just their mere presence. So we have to stand up to that. And I think that we send a clear message that we don't think it's a useful use of resources, that we have better things to do in this state than to worry about that aspect of it, and that we're going to focus on criminal activity and not so much just the fact that someone happens to be an undocumented immigrant. So we have to move past that and start looking at what's best for our citizens.
Thank you. That's a great question. And I think that as Chief Law Enforcement Officer of the state of Delaware, the Attorney General has to step up and be a protector of every resident of the state. I just mentioned not cooperating with the discriminatory policies coming out of Washington, and that's one of them. I would not support ICE raids. I just wouldn't do it. Delaware residents should not be living in fear. The immigrant community, they enrich our community. They diversify our community. They contribute to our economy, and they shouldn't feel unsafe. And under no circumstances should they be feeling like they're being singled out or be fearful of being torn away from their community and their families. Thank you.
Thank you. This next question goes first to Mr. Johnson. You actually mentioned Eric Schneiderman. With the recent allegations against the resignation of New York's Attorney General, do you believe that orderly resignation is the proper action to take in the face of credible accusations of illegal behavior on the part of an elected official? And more broadly, what role do you believe Delaware's Attorney General should play in addressing the issues raised by the Me Too?
I believe immediate resignation is the way to go because now there is more awareness about this issue, but this isn't a new issue. It's been going on for a long time. Fortunately, Delaware is, hopefully not going to be in the paper, but it could happen. And I believe the Attorney General, can, in terms of take recourse, can, speak out on this because, again, behavior that may be criminal, then there's an aspect there, but also just ethically and for the public, there should be a sense of that the Attorney General is standing up for what's right. So I do applaud the efforts in New York and the senators up there who call for the immediate resignation of Attorney General Schneiderman. Again, it's a sad situation, but I'm glad folk are more aware now. And this movement is growing because, again, us knowing that the top law enforcement officer will stand up and speak out about anything, I believe that's what we need in Attorney General, and that's what I offer.
Thank you. Mr. Miller.
I believe that if you have credible evidence that resignation is the appropriate step, but I don't think you stop there. I think if there has been criminal behavior, if you're alleging that there's criminal activity, I think it needs to be investigated, not just say, oh, it's over with a resignation. I think there has to be some consequences to those actions, as anybody would if they're not similarly situated as an important figure in government or in business. If it was John Q. Citizen and someone came into the police department and that person didn't have a job to resign from or wasn't in a position of power, but did those type of activities, we'd expect the law enforcement to investigate and then for the AG's office to prosecute. So if it's appropriate, that's the stance that should happen. I think that we have to take an active part with these investigations, and a lot of times police departments call us in when there are politically sensitive investigations and they want the AG to be able to tell them whether or not there's probable cause or whether or not they have enough to move forward. And I think we should increase that role and be able to be available for those things coming in and make sure that there's credible evidence, and if there is, to move forward with it.
Thank you, Ms. Roberts.
I do believe that Schneiderman's resignation was appropriate. Quite frankly, I was disturbed by the allegations, and had he not resigned, I think that his continued service would have been a distraction. And there's a lot of work to be done in Attorney General's office throughout the country. So, to avoid the distraction, the resignation was appropriate. I also think that with the Me Too movement and these sorts of cases being, getting the attention that they are getting now, this is a huge opportunity for the community and the AG's office to really step up and be proactive in investigating these sorts of allegations aggressively. And when there are opportunities to prosecute, these cases should be prosecuted. So women are being empowered, they're reporting, and the AG's office has to be an advocate for them and make sure that there's follow through on those reports.
Ms. Jennings.
I'm really glad Schneiderman resigned. I read the New Yorker article, and it was appalling. And I am really glad there's a criminal investigation of his behavior at this time. For so many years, having come up in a law enforcement world that was largely male, as I indicated earlier, I have seen women really struggle in the workplace, and it's gosh darn hard to get ahead. And so many women have stayed silent for so long because they were afraid. They were afraid for their livelihood, and sometimes they've been afraid for their safety. One of the greatest things that has happened in this past couple of years is that women are starting to speak up. And we need more of this. We need more of this in every workplace in this country. And it begins with women having the courage to speak up and say no more. It is not okay to harass me in the workplace. It is not okay to behave in this manner. And the Attorney General should be the leader in this. The Attorney General sets an example. Women in leadership positions, I believe, lead to cultural change in offices throughout the country. I know the former head of the DuPont company, Ellen Kuhlman, is leading the charge to make sure that women are paid equally, to make sure that women are promoted, to make sure that there are women in leadership positions. And my hat's off to her. We will stop harassment when we stand up, all of us, all women together, and say no.
This next question goes first to Mr. Miller. Do you support civilian oversight of the police? Do you plan to make specific structural and policy changes to ensure police-involved shootings are thoroughly and fairly investigated and, if warranted, prosecuted?
Yes, I think the Department of Justice has always taken the stance that they look at whether or not the activities of the officer as complies with the justification statutes that's contained in Title 11. Right now, the Department of Justice does a very thorough investigation. What they do is they make sure that all the other agencies that are investigating at the same time, and sometimes there's as many as 2 or 3, that make sure all the reports are in it, that they've talked to everybody they can possibly talk to. I think that what does happen and has happened in the past, maybe not publicly, but if there are some personnel or some policies that haven't been adhered to or suggestions on training, that is usually back-channeled to the police department to make sure they're doing the proper training and what they should be doing. Maybe that should be done a little bit more in a public vein, but I think that the Department of Justice right now, through their Special Investigations Unit, does a very good job in a very difficult time. You have to look at the statute and what the justification statutes say, and that sometimes governs what that conduct will be. But I believe the fact that the manner in which it's being done, at least to my knowledge, has been done in a fair and equitable manner.
Thank you. Ms. Roberts.
The Department of Justice has an obligation to protect all of Delaware's citizens, and that includes investigating police-involved shootings. What I think is key is that the department independently, thoroughly investigate those incidents. The department needs to meet its obligation to ensure that if a use of force incident does fall within the justification statute, that the department has independently vetted that evidence and is absolutely sure of its outcome. So the department needs to has a separate division, the Office of Civil Rights and Public Trust, to conduct those investigations, which is key because they need to be done by prosecutors and investigators that function separate and apart from the criminal division, because we don't want there to be any inherent conflict in that work. But certainly that is a key role of the Department of Justice, and that needs to continue.
Thank you.
There will always be a tension between the work of a police officer and the work of a prosecutor, and that tension exists for a reason. Police officers have a different kind of job, and they make arrests, for example, based on probable cause, but a prosecutor cannot prosecute a case unless there's a reasonable likelihood of conviction. So there's a built-in tension there that exists for a reason and should exist. The other reason is that the Attorney General's office reviews police use of force to make a decision as to whether there should be a criminal prosecution. That is a very important role. The review should be made based on the facts, based on the law, and nothing more. That is why I authorized the prosecution of a police officer for kicking a man in the head who was being restrained. It's a very, very difficult prosecution, but I did that because I believed and believe to this day that that was the right thing to do. The best thing an attorney general can do is the right thing, even when it is difficult, even when it is unpopular. Win or lose, it is incumbent on us to have fidelity to the law and to be the guardians of justice.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson.
Yes, I believe in citizen oversight and the prosecution and involvement of police incidents. I'm just going to go out there and say it. Thing is, I have direct experience in this field. When I was with the city of Wilmington, I represented internal affairs, Office of Professional Standards. Because the question asked was, should citizens have some oversight? And the answer is yes. And that's what the community wants. I want to go back a few years ago. I did community policing forums with the faith community and community leaders in Hicks-Anderson and other community centers throughout the city, just to talk about what does the community want to see in our justice system. See, I've actually gone out there and done it. This is not as part of my job, but in my spare time. And I can tell you, they want involvement. And there are citizen oversight boards right up the road in Philadelphia. They've had one for over 15 years. So I don't know why we can't have one in Delaware, because there should be one. And what it does is it builds trust in the system. Because the fact is, the criminal context is a little different. The criminal context, I believe, needs to continue, having the Attorney General be the one to investigate. But I'm talking about the civil side, where officers can be disciplined, officer misconduct is looked at. And that's where citizens should have buy-in. And other jurisdictions have it throughout this country. And I do not know why Delaware does not have one. But I can tell you, under my Attorney General leadership, citizens will have a say in what goes on. At the end of the day, citizen oversight boards in other jurisdictions, they don't have the power to discipline officers. But it just gives the community buy-in. It gives the community faith and hope in the system. And that's what I will restore under my Attorney General leadership.
Thank you. This next question goes first to Mr. Roberts. How aggressively will you handle FOIA queries, requests, and complaints against A, the governor's office, B, against your own office?
So I'm a firm believer in government transparency. The public has a right to know certain information about what's going on within the government, and thus we have a FOIA statute. So it doesn't matter whether it's the governor's office or the Department of Justice. We're no different than any other state entity. We're subject to the FOIA statute. At the Department of Justice, when I served as the Chief Deputy Attorney General, I issued FOIA opinions. I think that it's certainly important that government agencies are leaning on their counsel at the Department of Justice to make sure that they're complying and providing the information that's requested, as long as it is required under the law. And when it's not, to the extent that they can be transparent, it's important that that information be disclosed. So as Attorney General, I will continue to make that training for deputies a priority to make sure that they can provide sound counsel to state agencies for the purposes of transparency. But I certainly believe that as the Department of Justice, since FOIA opinions are issued out of that office, we really set the standard. We have to set the standard for transparency and be an example for other state agencies. And if I didn't answer it, yes, the governor's office would be subject to FOIA just like any other state entity.
Thank you, Ms. Jones.
Transparency is critical to the effective oversight by the public of every government office. Transparency is critical. But I would go above and beyond FOIA, because I think the Attorney General's office in particular should be more transparent. We should put out there our policies on everything, because it shouldn't be a secret. And we should be accountable to the public for our actions. So it shouldn't be a secret why decisions are made within the Attorney General's office when the press or the public wants to know why something happened. And that goes beyond FOIA. That really goes to the very core of the operation of the office. It is incumbent upon every agency to answer to the public. And we can only answer to the public effectively if we are revealing as much information as we are legally allowed to reveal, so that the public understands the reasons why decisions are made. And so as Attorney General, I would be transparent, and I would make sure that the public knew the reasons for every decision that got made, unless there was some legal impediment to doing that.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson.
My Attorney General's office will again work on both making the Attorney General's office accessible and transparent, but also the Governor's office. In my role in the Governor's office, I was the FOIA coordinator for the office. So knowing just the problems in that field, it's very great because despite the evolution of FOIA guidelines, state agencies can't even fulfill their requests because the crushing workload. We have ancient systems. They don't have the technology. We in the governor's office, we didn't even have a scanning program to redact documents, and we actually got one when I was in office. It's that type of stuff that this halts our FOIA system. So citizens can't get the information they need because of the lack of resources state government has. And one way I have suggesting so we can get more resources by decreasing prison costs. But we also have to look at, again, just making government more accessible through open data. There was a push under the Markell administration, it's continuing under the Carney administration, to make data more accessible. So you can see procurement information, you can see Department of Corrections information, you can see Department of Labor information. That's the wave of the future, and continuing to advocate for open data is where I see we can win. Because again, FOIA is crushed because of ancient systems, so we must look at transparency through open data. And the number one thing I hear, I've been hearing for years, is that our police departments don't even have policies and directives online. Departments like Seattle, they have that. Departments throughout the country have it, but we don't have that in Delaware. And again, I will advocate for putting those policies online because, again, it builds trust in the community. And that's the key, to build trust of state government and law enforcement by setting an example.
Our FOIA system fails miserably in keeping with the actual statutes, what they tell you have to do. We don't do it in a timely fashion, and the Department of Justice is just as guilty as agencies are because of the timelines that we get complaints that we're supposed to respond to them in certain time frames. It just doesn't happen. And we either have to get more realistic timelines or we have to fix the problem, because it's kind of ludicrous when you have the Department of Justice who is not following the law as it's supposed to be done. And a lot of it's the fact that you don't have the manpower. The other part is when you're dealing with, especially with other agencies, and when you're dealing with the complaints that come in, because the Department of Justice is the one that responds to these complaints, everybody wants to take their time in reviewing it, and everybody wants to redact this aspect or that aspect. So at the end of the day, your timelines are blown. And I'm not just saying by a day or a week. I'm talking by, months and sometimes longer than that. And that's unacceptable. And what we have to do is look within ourselves on how we're going to do it. And if the expectations and the statutes aren't realistic, then we have to then make our case to the legislators who set these timelines in place and say, hey, look, there's no way that we can do this with the workforce that we have or with the people that we have in place. So therefore, let's see if we can get a change. But other than that, if that's not going to happen, we have to either divert more resources to it to make sure that we're leading the charge by making sure that we're adhering to deadlines. Because if the Department of Justice isn't doing it, how are we going to be telling the governor's office, the treasurer's office, whomever, that they're not going by the guidelines when, in fact, we're not doing it either? So it's kind of hypocritical. And we have to look at that and figure out what's the way to get around that and to make it fixed, because right now it's just not working. It's not being adhered to, and it's it all depends on how things are flowing at that particular time, whether or not you're going to be within the time limits or not, and that's just unacceptable. There should be some consistency.
This next question goes first to Ms. Jennings. There is a relatively new office in the Department of Justice devoted to the question of public trust. Many active Democrats, this question reads, have stories about questionable behavior by elected officials that should have prompted an investigation by the Attorney General's office. If you become aware of any information that suggests misconduct, how would you go about handling it, and what steps would you take to clarify the situation to the public?
Thank you for that question. The Attorney General's office does investigate allegations of misconduct. The Office of Civil Rights and Public Trust handles such matters, as does the Special Investigation Unit of the Attorney General's office. But we need more resources in those critically important areas, because violations of the public trust are critically important to investigate. And they have to be investigated fully, fairly, and timely. Because if they take too long, then justice is not served. And so the Office of Civil Rights and Public Trust needs to have the resources available to it to do its job effectively. Because if there is a violation of the public trust, we need to address it as soon as possible. And we need to address it as a priority in the office. And so as Attorney General, I would grow the Office of Civil Rights and Public Trust, because that is a very important part of the function of the Attorney General, to make sure that our elected officials, government officials, are doing their jobs, and they're doing their jobs right with fidelity to the people that we serve. And so it is incumbent upon us to handle those matters appropriately.
Thank you. Mr. Johnson.
Under my Attorney General leadership, the Office of Public Trust, it has to be realigned. Again, it's severely under-resourced. You probably will hear everyone on stage say that, and so that's a big problem, because it's in effect it's not an effective unit. But taking even a step further from misconduct cases, it also should be looking at convictions. It should be, looking at convictions and making sure that the integrity of the cases that it prosecutes are in fact, the proper the actions were done. So again, the conviction review unit is key. And I've heard stories time and time again of stuff that has been reported to the office, but yet not one conviction has been overturned. So, it just needs to be a top-down, just I think, analysis of how it can be fully staffed and resourced, but also it has to have the right people in there. It has to have the people that, have the ties to the community and are able to communicate with folk up and down the state. Because again, you need the personnel in that office to be, they have to have the utmost trust of the community. So that's my plan for reviving that unit, and again, through many other actions, we hopefully can resource it well, and we can really staff it and make sure it's an effective unit for Delaware.
Thank you, Mr. Mullane.
Whatever you call the unit, I mean, prior my time there, it was the special investigations. They broke that off and put part of it into that, which is why that it's understaffed, because you went from a full unit that was handling those type of issues to now, or it was only part of that unit. So there is a staffing issue there that makes it hard to do your job. A lot of times the Attorney General's office is actually, in some of these cases, it always involves an audit or some type of financial impropriety. And so a lot of times the AG's office is working with another entity, whether it's the auditor's office or some other function, looking for ways to do it. Chip Flowers was the perfect example, where the auditor's office we gave them whatever resources they wanted, but they were driving the bus because we were a support agency to them. But you do have to, if you wanted to function and deal with the various complaints that you get, you have to have the resources to do that. And I think that you have to, whatever you call it, you have to have the resources to be able to do the task that you're being tasked to do. So I strongly urge the fact that we put as many of the resources that we have, existing resources, because I think we also have to look at reality. Our budget, when the AG comes in, he's operating with the budget that was done by his predecessor. There's not going to be a lot of fat in that where he's going to be able to move money around. That's a reality. And then when when we first go in, we have to sit down and set the budget for the next fiscal year. So what you've got to be able to do in the short term is see ways to move some resources to those areas that are important to you. And I think that there's resources that can be diverted in the short term until you be able to get some long-term assistance to that area.
Ms. Robertson.
So allegations of misconduct by public officials those are some of the most serious cases that we see at the Department of Justice. And investigating those cases is an important function of the Office of Civil Rights and Public Trust. I do agree with everyone on this panel. That is a very small office, and it really needs more resources, whether it be attorneys and investigators. It really needs to grow because it really can ultimately impact the quality of the work that unit can do. I think the first part of your question was how would those investigations be initiated? And I think that the office has an obligation to really be proactive. So investigations that are initiated through the Office of Civil Rights and Public Trust can happen multiple ways. They can either be a direct referral of a situation to the office, or it could come in the form of just loose reports that you hear about potential misconduct, whether they come from, the News Journal or different sources. But the office has an obligation to really step up and investigate every case. But doing that work will require more resources, and those resources need to be made a priority. I would do so as Attorney General.
Thank you. Ms. Jennings mentioned that she would testify on the floor of the General Assembly against the mandatory minimums bill that we discussed. The last two questions of the night deal with how and when you will use that power, which is, those who've worked in Dover know the Attorney General's voice carries a lot of weight and law on matters of criminal justice. So the first question is, would you testify in support of legislation legalizing recreational marijuana And that goes first to Mr.
Yes, I would. Simple as that. It doesn't. It's just common sense. Number one, the criminal justice aspect of making legal marijuana, it has a vast impact. Okay, yes, it has been decriminalized, but it's still used, by police to, search vehicles, to stop and frisk. It's still used as a weapon against communities, mainly low-income and minority communities at that. So again, we have to take it off the table from a criminal justice perspective and a fairness perspective, and just say, hey, look, we're going to take it off the table. And the second part, honestly, is just the revenue part. We've all talked about the resources the state doesn't have. So we can't turn down a viable new industry that will add thousands and thousands of jobs, especially in Kent and Sussex. So yes, I will support legalization. I'm not sure about the current bill right now, what the status is, but I will be down there in support of it because, again, it's from a fairness perspective. And other states are now going to be legalizing it. Our neighbor right up the road, New Jersey, is making inroads under Governor Phil Murphy to take steps to legalize marijuana. So I believe Delaware needs, again, be the first state, and it needs to be one of the first in the region to support and legalize marijuana and regulate it effectively and safely.
Thank you, Mr. Murphy.
No, I would, and I'll tell you why. In my current position, I travel across the country, and I have a lot of conversations with those people that are out in Colorado and so forth. There's a lot of problems they have with their marijuana statutes. A lot of issues that they think need to be resolved involved with driving and what's the standard for a DUI, driving while under the influence. There are too many questions to be asked to rush into it, and especially for an economic purpose. I'm looking at what's the welfare of the citizens of the state. Until I have more information that contradicts some of the stuff that I'm hearing from law enforcement and the problems they're having dealing with the issue, I would not support that. Now, if there are studies that later come out and there's ways to deal with the driving issue and how you measure it and how you're going to deal with it, then yes, I'd reconsider. But the bottom line is, right now, I don't think we have enough information to make a decision that we can say with some type of certainty that we can handle it from a law enforcement perspective when we're having people utilize this drug as a recreational drug.
So this is certainly a hot topic, and I think that I would certainly testify at the General Assembly with regard to marijuana legalization. I'm in support of marijuana being regulated and taxed similar to alcohol. I think the economic benefits are quite clear. So the state could certainly benefit from the revenues. And I think the regulation piece is really key because, safety, we need to make sure that we are keeping recreational drugs away from our children. So to the extent that marijuana can be regulated in a safe way, it can be helpful to Delawareans on the economic end.
I am certainly open to the full legalization of marijuana. I supported the decriminalization of marijuana, helped draft the statute that made personal use of marijuana a civil citation. I supported medical marijuana legalization so that people could get the much-needed benefit for medical conditions. And it's my understanding that there's a need to expand the number of conditions. But first, and it's always the but first. First of all, it's still illegal federally. And so that means that at any point in time, our president and our administration federally could swoop in and take it all away. Second, as a result of it still being illegal federally, it's a cash business, which creates its own set of issues. I hear from employers up and down the state that they're very concerned because there are really no good standards set, for blood testing, for other testing in terms of whether someone is under the influence, whether someone can be on a work site or not. And so we need first to make sure that these issues are resolved. But I am certainly open to full legalization. I also think it is critically important that we have the safety of our children as the first priority if this were to happen, to make sure that it is kept out of the hands of children.
Our last question of the night goes first to Mr. Mullaney, who was last for opening statements, and that is, if there is legislation in the General Assembly to reinstate the death penalty in Delaware, will you testify against it?
No, I will not. I believe that I think there's a purpose for the death penalty. I think it's a very narrow purpose, narrow scope for first responders, for correctional officers within the facility. I think there has to be some consequences, and so I wouldn't support I would support legislation that would bring it back on a limited basis. Let me just segue off of that real quick, because I don't know if I'll get an opportunity to say it. Right now, there's getting ready to be a bill introduced in the legislature that is going to totally revamp the entire criminal justice system. It's going to be, I believe it's going to be House Bill 9 and 10. I think it's split up in two things. It's going to be on the agenda back around June 6th when they come back. And that is the most important piece of legislation this entire year and next year, because that bill is going to totally change the way we do business. And that's where we should be now looking at that and questioning it, because it's coming in late in the session. It deals with minimum mandatories, putting charges together, and we should be looking at that as well. I just wanted to bring that out there. I got a call today that it's going to be on the agenda once they get back, and I think it's something that we should know about and should actively be looking to investigate.
Robert.
I would absolutely testify against the reinstatement of the death penalty. I don't believe that the state should be in the business of killing people. It's really that simple. And we know that it's fiscally irresponsible as well. It's just very costly. There's absolutely no reason for the death penalty to be reinstated. If that bill does pass, I would, as an individual and as Attorney General, I would also advocate for it to be repealed.
Ms. Jen.
I do not support the death penalty, and I would testify against it. I'm the only person sitting up here this evening who was actually prosecuted a capital case. It was serial killer Stephen Brian Pennell. And he wanted to be executed. He was executed. It was the taking of a human life. I have also represented a man who was on death row, who was executed. That's the taking of a human life. I have struggled with this for years and have seen at homicide scenes man's inhumanity to man, up close and personal. It changes you. It's horrific, some of the horrible acts that another human being can inflict on another person, on a victim. Having said all that, I believe it's morally wrong, and I believe, first and foremost, it just doesn't work. It has not made us any safer. It does not deter crime. So from a moral perspective and from a very practical perspective, we should not bring back the death penalty in this state.
Mr. Johnson.
I know it's getting late, but say it. Very interesting how political campaign stances somewhat changed. Could have sworn when this race began, some people probably supported death penalty. Now it's a little bit different talk. So I found that interesting in the political process how that happens. But look, from day one, for years, I have been advocating against the death penalty. Been working with community groups to advocate against the death penalty. I still remain firmly in that place. So it is no change now. And I just want to say that very clearly. There's no change. And so again, it needs to be off the table because it is, number one, ineffective. There's no studies that show it's been effective. It wastes a lot of money, which we don't have. And three, just from a human rights perspective, we just need to take it off the table. So again, my story has not changed. I have been an advocate from the beginning against the death penalty. I will testify ardently against it because, again, it's a colossal waste of time and resources, and we need to stop talking about this and start talking about how we can make our community safer.
Thank you very much. Can we give a hand to the candidates?